Hello and welcome to Libero, the podcast about the most important of the least important things, as Peter Hillwood once said. My name is Jack Pitt-Brooke, I'm from The Athletic. As ever, I'm going to start today's episode by saying please like, share, subscribe, comment on our content. You can find us on X, on Blue Sky, on TikTok, on Instagram. It all makes a difference. Now, I'm joined today by Tariq Panja from the New York Times, and by Tariq, and by Miguel Delaney from The Independent. Is it too late to say happy birthday, Miguel?
It never is. It will be the second time on the show I've been wished happy birthday, so that's quite nice.
Did you have a nice birthday weekend?
Yeah, I did. I talked the other day about having my birthday in Bilbao itself, and on Friday, I went there a few drinks around London Bridge. People bought me shots, which I'm a bit old for now, and don't really have a good effect. Yeah.
How many Libero members were at your birthday?
4, including myself. Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. Tariq.
A party in 2 countries. I think it's a fairly great birthday week, Miguel.
And then I guess the highlight of your birthday weekend was Arsenal 1, Manchester City 1.
Yeah, you could say that. No, it was a strange game, but an absorbing game. Like, I didn't think it was a very. Maybe this is a lot of modern football, given what we discuss a lot on the podcast. As a pure football match, it wasn't great in terms of things that happened and things that excite you. As a sort of a vehicle for storylines and how developments, played into storylines, I thought was fascinating. Obviously there's been a big debate about, Arteta and where he is. I thought the most interesting thing about the match was this historical break of Guardiola doing something that 15 years ago, or in the middle of that Inter-Barcelona match, you could never have imagined. Because in this case, he was Inter Milan. And I think there's, the lads touched on this recently in terms of the post-Pep world. And I think this all ties in with how kind of, Arsenal's focus on long throws, all of that. But it does feel like that after an era where everyone plays some derivation of the Guardiola way, and that has tied in with the spread of technology and analytics to the point there where, people were taking short corners because the analytics said it was better to keep possession. That's why we weren't seeing as many long shots. I think that all ties in now with coaches, and particularly, I suppose, coaches who think a lot, like Guardiola and Arteta, looking for any advantage they can. So suddenly, Arteta's obviously gone for a lot of set-piece play that Donnarumma counted. And Guardiola is now, as a changed world does some version of what he did before, he now does something else. So it's both the most anti-Guardiola thing possible and arguably the most, Guardiola thing possible. And in the middle of all that, Arsenal draw and allow Liverpool to go 5 points clear.
I thought that was, like Miguel, really interesting. The Arteta part, I think, was quite predictable. Unfortunately, this the Liverpool game and the first half against City, both teams at Arsenal, if they had the right mindset, and you can feel it with the fans as well. There was I don't know, Miguel, if you were there, it felt a bit flat. Like he's named this team, not the team maybe that he could have named, and they felt nervy and edgy. And the fans of that ground, for some reason, more than other places, they can quickly turn. I think for Arteta in the long term, that's going to be something to look for, because this is the season they're going to have. Those fans really are on a knife edge every game, and the team is as well. They looked in that first half. If they just go for it, they've got a chance, and it's like something is holding them back. And I think it might be the coach. But the most interesting thing there was Guardiola. Then I was thinking, do you reckon he might be a bit bored? And he said, you know what? I'm just going to do something completely different here. And see if I can do this.
Well, this is the amazing thing, right? Is that he's brought back the big athletic, powerful number 9. He's brought back the goalkeeper that doesn't kick, and now he's playing Mourinho ball. Basically, you could say it's the ultimate triumph of Mourinho over Guardiola. Miguel, do you buy this? There's a kind of narrative out there now, which is that Arteta is in these big games. He's too reliant on marginal gains rather than relying on the quality of his individual players, and that is going to really hinder Arsenal's ability to win these big matches. We've seen it at Anfield, we've seen it against City, and it's going to cost them the league. Do you buy that narrative?
I think there's a truth to it. I don't think it's wholly true, and I think that was maybe the latter was going to be signified by how, to be fair, at half time he did switch up, he did go for it. I think my main issue, yes, I think maybe more than going for marginal games. I think Arteta, he thinks about his preparation to every match so much. He's quite Guardiola like in that sense, and I think can sometimes overthink. And I think that was a case yesterday where he went for a midfield that prioritized technical possession. And then suddenly that was a game where they didn't need technical possession to the same degree. They needed game breakers because City sat back so deep and congested. So they needed players to open. And he left most of his players that would open a team on the bench from not just Eze or Saka, but also Miles Lewis-Skelly, who could drive at City in a way, a player that I don't think they had. So I think he did rectify it second half. I think it's going to be one of the kind of dynamics to this season, I suppose, now. That Arsenal, they have to chase Liverpool, but they have to chase them with force. It's almost that little bit of a kind of a Klopp Guardiola dynamic now from 5 years ago.
Yeah, I think part of the narrative too is that squad is incredible. Whichever way you look at it, it's so stacked with great attacking players, and they can do it. I think that's what, like man for man, they've got three players in every position, and particularly the forward positions. And then when you see the approach with that squad, I think people will then ask, well, why don't you unleash this? Obviously, he knows what he's doing. But the other Mourinho Guardiola aspect in that game was City just lumping the ball upfield, knowing that Drogba, in this case Haaland, is going to get every ball and occupy the entire back foot. It was really interesting to watch that. It felt like Chelsea 2006, 7, whenever that was.
I wrote this in a piece for The Independent. It didn't just remind me of Inter. That was obviously the main comparison, but also an element of, and Guardiola will love this one, I'm sure, Real Madrid 2004. Casillas keeping them out, Ronaldo sticking them in. It was basically Donnarumma and Haaland. And Haaland actually spent a lot of the game as well, just whacking the ball clear from City's area. But I thought it was striking as well that in a way I haven't seen with Arsenal set pieces, Donnarumma met everything. And I wouldn't, like Sasha Goryanov raised the point about whether set piece coaches are now forcing evolution in a goalkeeper. But before we move on, just to pick on one thing Tariq said as well, I do think that the weight around Arsenal is now, it's tangibly affecting their games. You could really feel that the flatness went to agitation in the first half. You could really feel it before half time. Then, to be fair, when Arteta brought on Eze and Saka, it was like the crowd thinking, okay, now that's finally, and you could feel the tone change. And then I suppose that's why the late goal was a little bit of a narrative buster.
I just want to, before we move on, one final question for Miguel on Arsenal. Do you worry that weight and pressure on the Arsenal players and on Arteta, do you think that will be more of an impediment to their winning the league than even the 5-point deficit to Liverpool at the moment?
So I think it has the potential to amplify the effects of the 5-point deficit, because I think now already they're in a situation where if they go to Newcastle next week or whoever, or any home game, and they're not winning, what they should just be doing is obviously going through the process, trust themselves, they have the squad, they have the talent, but we'll be able to feel that kind of, that it's beyond urgency. It's this kind of this rush to try and get something done. And maybe there was an element of that to yesterday's game as well. And I think we discussed this show before. I think one of the fascinating elements this season is going to be what wins out. Liverpool investing in a higher level of individual quality on the whole, or Arsenal investing in depth. I given how taxing a game every 3 days is, I'd lean towards Arsenal's depth. But the danger for them is we could have a situation like last season where by the time that matters, Liverpool have a decisive lead.
Yeah, but just with Liverpool, I think you're right here. With all that recruitment, and you watched the games this season, those last minute victories, they've looked so vulnerable. And this is with all of the talent fresh at the moment, and obviously Isak coming in, but it's in positions where they're well loaded. With Liverpool, you look at this and you think, if Gravenberch is injured, there isn't depth. Konate, when his hamstring goes, which it will at some point, because it does most seasons for a few weeks or whenever, you're down to maybe just Gomez. And there was 2 or 3 seasons ago, you've got these two kids who, you haven't seen them in the Premier League again, being the two central defenders for Liverpool. Liverpool's recruitment has been quite exciting, but I don't know. They just seem a lot more vulnerable than Arsenal through a season.
Yeah, it's going to be really interesting. So on today's episode, we want to take a look at things that are happening away from the pitch, with particular reference to Arsenal, who had a huge week last week, even before the Manchester City game, with the news coming out on Friday morning that Tim Lewis has left his job as executive vice chair after 3 years effectively running Arsenal. Been a director before then. Managing director Richard Garlick has been promoted to CEO as part of this big boardroom shake-up at Arsenal. And this news obviously came 2 weeks after Daniel Levy, who was Tottenham chairman for almost 25 years, was sacked by the majority shareholding Lewis family, bringing to an end a working partnership between the Lewis family and Levy that really defined Tottenham Hotspur in the 21st century. So it's been a really busy week in the boardrooms of North London, and one that I think underlines the fact that now in 2025 we are very much in the age of the owner, you could call it in modern football, or at least the age of the boardroom. Before we get on to Daniel Levy, we're going to talk about Tim Lewis. Miguel, can you just explain to our listeners who Tim Lewis is and what he did at Arsenal over the years?
Yeah, and I will just preface that by saying, so the line from within Arsenal about all this is that a bit of spring cleaning, evolution. I think that is very much underplaying the one figure at the club who has been, a better way to phrase it is, the most powerful figure of the club, if not the most important, given that's obviously now Arteta, essentially the figure who empowered Arteta. And even at rough moments in Arteta's early years, and you could even say maybe some of the doubt of the last 2 years, Lewis has been willing to back him. The very factor in this situation comes from Lewis being put in there in 2020 and engaging, and in the middle of COVID, let's not forget, as the club was a basket case at the time, and engaging in what was described by people within the club as open heart surgery, which was what they needed. A lot of those decisions were unpopular and controversial, like the kind of, the streamlining of staff, which is obviously a very generous description or something like that. There was a change to approach, including, say, Raul Sanllehi, who'd been seen as kind of indecisive and a big signing like Pepe. He was moved on. Parameters were set around transfers. They essentially went for a while for a Borussia Dortmund model. The entire outlook of the club was changed, really, and everything was centralised around Arteta. And, I mean, without putting too fine a point of it, I mean, he was essentially the Kroenkes representative on earth, the Kroenkes representative in London. He was their voice, which is why I think this is a really significant change, with the irony being that while the official explanation within Arsenal is evolution, there is a perception outside that this is actually about the idea that Arsenal had been sort of like, if not quite a fully autonomous entity within the Kroenke empire, they've been very much Arsenal, who are part of the Kroenkes. Whereas now, the suggestion seemed to be, or what people think, is that this is an attempt to kind of bring Arsenal into not quite a multi-club model, but this kind of multi-sports franchise model. And I think at least that is pointed to by the presence of so many Kroenke figures on the board now. And also the fact that Josh Kroenke he's much more visible around the club. I was at the PFA Awards a month ago and Josh Kroenke was there. This was at a moment where, unbeknownst to everyone at the time, Arsenal were actually negotiating for Eberechi Eze. Kroenke was involved in that. Obviously, Tim Lewis, I mean, just another example, was central to that. And there's a lot of talk about how the deal got done because of Lewis's relationship with Steve Parish, the Crystal Palace chairman. We are talking about this immensely significant figure in Arsenal's modern history. He had a reputation for abrasiveness. He could be forthright. He wasn't afraid to say what he thought. That earned him a reputation for Premier League meetings. But as someone else said to me this weekend, relationships between City and Arsenal were already very frosty, partly as a consequence of Tim Lewis. That they probably wouldn't have been too upset to not see him this weekend, but I don't think there was much of a relationship anyway. But as someone said, yeah, he was one of the people in the Premier League who was, quote unquote, willing to stand up to City. He had very strong opinions on state ownership and how this affects the dynamics of the game. He was very strong on regulation. And it's almost, to a certain degree, on issues like that, him and Levy are kind of two sides of the same coin. Levy was never as abrasive or outspoken with it as Lewis, but he had kind of his own strong opinions, and some of that, I suppose, is kind of like just underscoring meetings. Whereas it was Lewis who was willing to go out there and say what he felt needed saying, and it's a big change both to the gravitational forces within Arsenal and within the Premier League.
One of the interesting things that I think about Tim Lewis, right, is his background. He was a M&A lawyer by trade. He was a partner at Clifford Chance for 12 years. So, right at the top of the magic circle. He initially he advised Dan Kroenke on his initial share purchase at Arsenal, right, back in, I think it was 2006 and
2007. Yeah, so like
2007, back in that kind of like, will it be Kroenke, will it be Usmanov era, which sort of dominated Arsenal in the sort of, I guess, the second half of the Wenger era, perhaps. So and I guess what's interesting to me, right, is that now the person who ran Arsenal for years was somebody from a really kind of like high-end professional services background. Tariq, does that tell us a lot about how a big modern Premier League club has to operate?
Yeah, a little bit, and also about relationships in a way. The story goes that he was in the taxi, the black cab, with Stan Kroenke to ITV, whose shares they initially bought, I think it was £45 million, and he's there. And often these wealthy guys, or these outsiders, if they want, they're from overseas anyway, don't know anything about the industry, or even then, the person who helped paved the way for the deal, who was side by side in the tough negotiations. A bond is built in those moments. And so it's not the first one. I can remember two pretty big figures in the Premier League era. First would be, say, Bruce Buck. He was working for Skadden Arps, another big American law firm in London when Roman Abramovich bought Chelsea. He was Abramovich's lawyer, effectively. And he's made chairman at Chelsea and a huge figure in the Premier League. He was the guy negotiating, Richard Scudamore with former chief executives' bonuses and stuff. And he was on the remuneration committee. He was like Chelsea, Abramovich man on earth, if you want, or in football. And then the other one is Ed Woodward at Manchester United. So Woodward was a JP Morgan banker who helped finance, extremely controversial leverage buyout by the Glazer family. They owe millions, if not billions, to that deal. It's perhaps one of the, from a financial point of view or profit point of view, probably one of the most successful ever investments in sport on a money basis. Obviously, it was seen as awful and gross, and there won't be a lot of people arguing about that, and that's probably for another pod. But in that, they have this guy who they have this bond with him and him with them, and you place these people in. But to your point, this is huge business now. Football teams are an asset class in themselves. Just this week, you hear, Apollo, another private equity firm in America, have got this $5 billion sports fund, and they're looking to take control of Atletico Madrid. This is the financiers taking control of football and then introducing all of these complexities in a way, financial complexities into the game that allow them to do, as we're seeing with Chelsea, things that, a lot of people aren't comfortable with.
I thought on exactly that, and I completely agree, Tariq. Sam Wallace made an excellent point in his column for The Telegraph on Sunday where, look, football is obviously massive business now. I think that's something that's self-evident. It's one of the reasons I would, of course, one of many reasons I have objections to this is because football is a sport primarily, and it's always been the two, but now it's just how much is governed by the business side. But that is now having a kind of an alternative effect, which I think Sam touched on. While yes, it's business, and so much is going to be dictated by pure financial results, actual sporting results bring a completely different dimension to that. And suddenly you have business decisions or what you would see as potentially business decisions affected by the massive PR that comes with what happens on a football pitch. And I think that's a really interesting dimension. Like, from speaking to people who work in this, they talk about how one of the biggest issues that they see, and so I had this conversation 2 years ago, so it precedes a lot what's happened now. But it was from someone who works and all that, who's worked in kind of takeovers of private equity, and said what they really see is that you have the most sensible and responsible business people possible. And once they're in football, it's like they can't help ego taking over. Because suddenly, and it's why so many of them start to get involved in. They love the the wheeling and dealing of transfer decisions. They like how suddenly that a business decision that they make is responsible for the happiness of millions of people. And obviously, and that of course will be addictive. So while it's obviously had a massive effect on football, I think it's just as interesting how it's had an effect on the other side of it.
Do you think that's because if you look at the backgrounds of a lot of these people who go into running football, as Tariq says, they've either been, they're corporate lawyers who've been instructed by people who are rich enough to buy a football club, or like Ed Woodward, they've been, wealth managers basically, who have been who've been managing the wealth of people who are rich enough to buy a football club. And so I guess if you're a younger listener out there and you're wondering, how can I run a football club one day? Maybe these are the career decisions you should make. Maybe you should try and get a training contract at a city law firm. But when people from those backgrounds then go into football clubs, Miguel, do you think that just the sheer fun of not having to worry about investments or contracts or whatever, but thinking, I'm going to go and buy somebody from Benfica for 70 million euros. That's good. That's far more fun than just managing money all day. Do you think that kind of hooks them?
It just has to be an element. They can't, it's human nature. And even this is a simple comparison, no one celebrates really, or sorry, you don't get a stadium of 70,000 people celebrating the signing of a contract for a merger and acquisition. You do when a signing that you've been responsible for scores the winning goal in the derby. And that has to start shaping people, even if it's subconscious. It has to have some sort of. I know we'll get onto this, but I remember one of the things I was always told about Levy, and I'm like, Jack, you'll know this better than anyone, but was basically that at around 2017 and 2018, Tino wanted to sell players he wanted to do what Liverpool did, sell his overperforming players for big money and take the squad to the next level with new signings. And Levy refused because he didn't think that's what a big club does. Now, what is that if not getting, maybe not Levy's personal ego, but even the obsession with the idea of being a big club rather than necessarily kind of seeing what was the most logical, transfer rationale here.
There's human nature to it as well. Like all the other deals, I think Miguel said, no one's celebrating a merger and acquisition. Maybe the shareholders, obviously, who've made a load of money probably, but they're not, all over Twitter or in a football stadium. So I think the human nature and the ego is bound to play a role in this, because you suddenly, from being a grey suit, you become an immensely public figure, right? You are almost a figurehead for all of these people. Each of these clubs is big ones, almost like leading a religion, right? You are like leading this group of people and leading this organization with the manager and all the rest of it. And with the pivotal chance of you've got the pen in your hand to sign the player, thumb up, thumb down, it's quite a lot of power. And it, in a way, I don't know, the addiction point Miguel raised probably apt as well. People who, there's an element of gambling as well in that as well. If we drop 70 million on this guy, could we go up? Could I be a hero? Could we be big? And I challenge anyone. I know we've not done this, but how many weeks until it takes for you to go native in this environment? So it takes a very, very strong kind of level of restraint, I guess, not to have football and the football the environment of football take over your being, from being a sensible accountant or lawyer or financier or etc.
But the irony with Lewis, actually, I felt from what I know that restraint was still there. He's a hard-headed figure in that way, and obviously, as Jack's pointed to the legal background, I don't think he was. from what I know, subject to these forces in the same way, but I can't say that for certain, obviously. And maybe that's about kind of maybe there are a few echoes of Spurs there, just in the sense of where the club want to go next. I mean, the very fact they've changed indicates some sort of change in direction. Maybe not as pronounced as Spurs, but obviously Spurs have wanted to move from this kind of very macro, business-focused approach to one that actually where they start to win more on the pitch.
Yeah, I want to move on to talking about Spurs now, because 2 weeks before Tim Lewis's departure from Arsenal was, I think, one of the biggest off-field stories in the Premier League in recent years, which was the quite sudden and shock removal, you call it sacking, I suppose, of Daniel Levy by the majority shareholding Lewis family at Tottenham Hotspur. I mean, you've got to remember here that Levy was not just the longest running chairman of this Premier League era. You know, he'd been there for ENIC bought their stake from Alan Sugar in late 2000. Daniel Levy became the chairman in early 2001, but also he was the most powerful single executive at any Premier League club over that time span. He was he was more than just a chairman. He basically ran the club. Like, he was famously across all the details. Some people called him a micromanager. This, when they built the stadium, he was across all the details of the stadium. When they were negotiating for players in the market, he would always take a lead on that. He was very busy with decisions around recruitment and managers and directors of football and so on. He certainly got through a lot of managers and a lot of directors of football over the course of his time running Spurs. It felt like his club. It almost felt as if he was the owner, which of course he wasn't. It almost felt like he was the founder, just in that sense of very personal control. And he ran Tottenham with two very, basically in a closed circle, the Holy Trinity, him and two other people who were very close to him for such a long time. And then out of the blue, he's gone. I can't really think of an equivalent in the Premier League, an equivalent story to this. And I think he is, whether you think he was a success or not as Tottenham chairman, I certainly think he had a lot of successes and, as well as some big gaps on the CV when it comes to success on the field. Miguel, it's hard to argue that he's one of the most significant figures of the Premier League era, isn't it?
Yeah. And I mean, another thing that's been said a lot within the debate around Levy is that it often felt like he was more respected among his peers outside the club than anywhere else, which is, I mean, to some degree, to considerable degree, I suppose, testament to him, really. I suppose you could say that people who really know what they're talking about in this and really know the challenges appreciate the job he's done. Of course, Levy isn't just answerable to those people, not answerable to those people at all. But I think there's certain truth to that, because when you stand back, what Levy has been responsible for is from incrementally moving Spurs from this sort of upper mid-table basket case, who are not really, occasionally they have a season of glory, and it was in a different era, to in an era where football has never been more financially stratified, something we've spoken about a lot in the pod, where Spurs probably shouldn't have been at that level. They certainly shouldn't have been involved in talks for Super League. And Levy incrementally moved them to that level. That is to his credit, but then it's offset by the fact, I think, and this is always the tension with Levy, in that it's sometimes felt he too often focused on the macro, the wider financial running of the club, and wasn't good enough on the micro, which actually undermined the macro. So there were specific moments, and one of them is the midpoint of the Pochettino era, where Spurs had the chance to leap to another era, and he didn't take it because I think they were too anchored to a previous approach.
And it wasn't just then, it was...
Sorry, just with Levy, I just think the most interesting thing in a way is he's kind of built a hugely successful business and maintained a fairly average football team along this pathway. If you look at that stadium project, everyone hands down says this is the best stadium in Europe. He's built that on fairly sound financial footing through the pandemic. So he's got that done. Got all those NFL contracts. He's built an entertainment business without the main source of this entertainment, the football team. Actually, Jack, you've seen them probably more than anyone else, but from my experience, from my childhood to Tottenham now, as a football team, they're kind of where they were when I was a kid. But they fell to the depth a little bit, mid 2000s. But sixth, fifth, that's where Spurs have been. But he's built a business around that is generating £600 million. Some of that is obviously down to the success of the Premier League, this juggernaut and the TV rights and everything else. Some of it down maybe to being in London, but a lot of the success has to be down to the planning of building this thing. However, if you're a Tottenham fan, decades have gone by and your team has effectively stood still. You've had the moment of takeoff, potentially Champions League final, Pochettino, very exciting football. The team could have won the league. Was it 2015, the year Leicester won? They were so close and needed to just do something. And this thing that Levy and Tottenham have been keen to stress is how stable they are financially, but they're almost too stable. That issue, or the thing that they are celebrating, is the fact that we only spend 45% of our revenue on wages. Yeah, but the thing is, you're not an island. You're not in isolation. You've got this huge ceiling above you. You don't need to get to 70%. You can get to 60, 65%. And you can imagine, as Miguel has said on many pods, wages often dictate how successful a football team is going to be. And I think if I'm a Tottenham fan, I'd be like, we can do this. Why are we not doing it? And it has happened, I guess, year after year after year. And something snapped. And it's kind of ironic that he's pushed out just at the end of the transfer window, like this period where he is, I guess, one of the most famous figures. That's what he's also remembered for, Daniel Levy in a transfer window.
2 points on that. Actually, there's a question I want to ask Jack at the end of this. I think there's absolutely something there. And stuff I heard over the summer, there was certainly a perception among other clubs that it was like this Tottenham didn't know how to spend big money. Now they suddenly had it, or now they could spend it. That was an interesting thing. Also, on the point about kind of making the leap when they were second or so. I mean, maybe that is almost an element where that's where you need to make decisions that are guided by a feel for football rather than a feel for there is an element of speculating to accumulate about it, just rolling the dice. It still matters because it is sport. And obviously it has to be within a kind of responsible framework. But what are Tottenham if not a responsible framework? And I suppose this is where maybe a question to you, Jack, in this, because I think from what Tariq has said there, and for all the praise that Levy has got for kind of transforming the club financially, is there an element actually that if you're a club in London in the Premier League with a bit of history, it's actually a no-brainer that you should be this financial juggernaut? In
theory, I see what you mean, but I think that, I can think of other clubs in London who have not massively cashed in recent years. West Ham being a great example. West Ham were gifted a stadium, and they're basically going nowhere. Whereas I think what I think is most impressive about the Levy era at Tottenham is that even though they had this, the kind of theory billionaire benefactor, it's not as if they were ever getting billionaire benefactor cash injections, right? Like they were. And if you think about the Levy era, right, the Levy era started, he was sat around the Premier League table at these chairman's meetings with with characters who now feel like they're from a completely different era, like Peter Hill-Wood, David Moores, Doug Ellis, Rupert Lowe, David Bernstein, all these guys. And now, 25 years, and then over the course of his time, he saw Abramovich come into Chelsea, he saw Thaksin Shinawatra come into Manchester City, and then replaced a year later by Sheikh Mansour. He saw Newcastle United go to Saudi Arabia eventually. He saw the Glazers coming into Manchester United, and obviously all the change that meant. So he saw the financial landscape completely transform, and he had to, off his own back, really try and create the conditions for Tottenham to compete in a stable way with teams who suddenly had far more money than Spurs did. and he built them the training ground in 2012, but opened the stadium in 2019. And I think all of that he did is incredibly impressive and does give Tottenham the basis to compete. Where he fell down, I think, and this is the point you made about feel for football, is that I don't really think he ever really knew what made a good team. He sort of, I mean, you could argue that, Pochettino was clearly a great appointment in 2014. You could maybe argue there's a degree of good fortune that, Harry Kane came through the academy at that point, and Pochettino was able to turn him and then some other good buys into great players. But I think that where I think he really fell down, and this maybe shows that perhaps he was at the club for too long, or whether he had that particular role that he had for too long, is that in the last, basically since the stadium opened in 2019, I felt like Spurs have had a little bit of an identity crisis, and their decisions, I think, were too much guided by, well, what would a big club do? And Miguel referenced that earlier with not selling players like Dele Alli and Danny Rose when they were at their peak under Pochettino, which is obviously what he wanted to do. You sell the players, you refresh them with new players to come in. You manage to keep the vibe going in the sort of way that Atletico Madrid do, for example. But then even since then, looking at the appointments of Mourinho, the appointments of Conte, even getting in the Amazon documentary, signing up to the Super League, like too much of what Spurs have done, I think, was too guided by, well, we're a big club now, we're going to act like one, rather than thinking, what is the best way for us to compete with teams who do have more money and more resources than we do?
Is it also knowing what you don't know and being comfortable with that? Again, ego here. Because all the things you've mentioned there are things maybe a football person you would bring in to say, look, you'll be my partner, whether it's director of football or just some football brains within the operation to say, look, I've given us this stable footing. I've given us this arena. This is what we would like to be. I don't have the expertise. I'm not the guy for this stuff.
Yeah,
Can you come in and do it?
I think that's a good point, and they tried that at points. Tottenham did often have a director of football. The most famous one being when they brought in Fabio Paratici as managing director of football from Juventus in 2021. But then less than 2 years later, he had to resign after he was banned from football for things that happened over the course of his time with Juventus. And obviously, he's still been around in the background since then, which is all consistent with his ban. But even then, when they have had directors of football, the director of football has often found that Daniel Levy's hands are on the steering wheel when it comes into the transfer window. And I think that there has never really been a consistent strategy other than the manager. Like the strategy was basically, we'll have Jose Mourinho as manager. The strategy was, we'll have Paratici and Conte, or rather then it was, the strategy was, we'll have Ange Postecoglou. So there was never really, and because of that, because the managers get sacked every 18 months, 2 years anyway, effectively, like, that means your strategy only lasts for 18 months or 2 years. And that's been, I think, one of the big stories at Spurs in the last sort of 6-7 years.
And just in terms of the money, you're right, Jack. I mean, he's done this flat, effectively. So they bought the club in, 2001?
So ENIC bought Alan Sugar's stake in December 2000.
Okay, right. So since then, we're to 2025, 24 years. The capital kind of investment from ENIC in that period is, I think, just less than 150 million, around 150 million pounds. And you add in inflation in that period of time as well, and like they really haven't put anything in. And Joe Lewis is a billionaire, and until this court case, where, I mean, this is the other aspect where Tottenham have been under scrutiny, is the fact that Joe Lewis had to plead guilty to insider trading in America, had to give up control of Tavistock Group, the company that owns ENIC, to his family and to the trustees there. That's one of the reasons we all know Daniel Levy really well as well, because maybe the actual owner, he was kind of so invisible until very recently. I don't think anyone could point out what Joe Lewis looks like in a lineup until some of this. So there is a bit of figureheading here. He was kind of, certainly from a visible point of view, seemed quite hands off, at least.
Coming up after the break, we will ask, which HBO drama does this all remind us of? I know it's a big cliche, but all of these boardroom boardroom dramas, especially the ones we've spoken about at Arsenal and Tottenham, does feel a lot like Succession. I don't think that's an original observation. Sam Wallace actually wrote a really, really good column in the Telegraph the other day, which I would recommend people reading if they can, about the comparisons between Succession and these scenarios. And it makes me think a few things. The first is that it's a bit of a sadness to me that to understand how football works in the modern era, you do need to understand a little bit about corporate governance, just like you need to understand about debt financing or the politics of the Gulf or competition law or the political status of Western-facing Russian oligarchs. But I'm afraid that is just the world we're in. But I think what particularly makes me think about Succession in these two cases, right, is the way that one of the central tensions of Succession is that you've got the family who own the company, and then you've got the executives who effectively run the company, but there's all, those two groups are effectively always separated, right? And there's kind of constant politics going on between and within the family and between and within the executive group, the executive class. And they're always, one is always trying to play them off against the other. Miguel, when you look at this, do you feel like this just shows you that in both the Arsenal and Tottenham cases, for as much as we and people might talk about the executives, it's the family, right? It's the family who call the shots.
And if you look at the really, really big developments in football, I mean, one of the most telling lines I've ever heard was when it came down to the Super League, the description was, quote unquote, it was an owner thing. That it happened way above. And obviously, they needed some of their executives to act on it. But then, strikingly, it was the executives that had to take, had to carry the can when it all went wrong, because you can't get rid of an owner in that way. Now, it's interesting, actually, that we're going down a world where the new independent football regulator, one of the workshops that's working now is, what potential reasons could force an owner to divest from an English football club. Now, I'm about to greatly deviate from that and kind of, I suppose, make an almost socio-political point about football. But all of this is exactly why I do find it a madness that cultural institutions that football clubs are, especially in a country like England, aren't some form of trust or fan ownership. Look, I'm wearing an Osasuna shirt, one of 4 fan-owned clubs in Spain. And that means whatever about the look, it's not perfect, it's not a panacea, but it does ultimately mean that clubs are self-contained entities without the same pressures from outside. As soon as you open it up to this wider world, a club can really go anywhere. And it's a big thing. All right, so while fans might love the idea of a big billionaire benefactor owner who loves the club, like this is almost seen as an ideal. Well, one of the obvious problems there that is so touched on by these stories is, well, the next generation just mightn't see it in the same way, and then suddenly the club faces the same other problems as ownership. And as soon as you're into that world where clubs can be traded and sold in that way, this is the problem you get into, and hence the game becomes enmeshed with all these forces. I mean, it is in some ways a madness. If you're drawing up a way to run a sport, it just it just wouldn't go down these lines.
Yeah, well, the skin in the game is, like you said, it's their money. So eventually, if it's a decision, like you said, like the Super League, it's going to come to tell that it's my money. If it's something that material, it will ultimately be the owner that's going to decide. And in terms of ownership models, it's probably a pod for another day. But the risk of the other models, say the fan-owned models you've seen with Laporta at Barcelona, etc., and Bartomeu, is when you're spending other people's money, you can go completely wild and also almost bankrupt the team out of populism and things like this. But football teams need a type of protection, don't they? Because, as you said, they aren't just a biscuit company or a rivet maker. There is a bigger thing, and people need to think about this. What that model is going to look like, I don't know. But the succession story is apt here, isn't it? Because also it's these kind of family dynamics which are often, at play here. My grandfather built this. My father built this. Legacy. I need to own this because it's my turn, and all the things like this. And the thing now with the Premier League, the numbers we're talking about. What Chelsea went for 2.5 billion. Tottenham, the numbers that they're talking about are in the realms. Manchester United's now valued at what, 4 or 5 billion pounds. So these numbers now are at levels that are kind of unheard of in England. But the NFL, the big American league, has kind of ahead here in terms of obviously size of business. They've been valued at these numbers for quite some years, and also have seen this family turmoil between generations changing. There was a big one in 2012, which involved the New Orleans Saints, and the owner was a guy called Tom Benson, and he'd put his granddaughter Rita Benson LeBlanc to run the club, and he was kind of grooming her to take over. And we'd come across her at one of those leaders in football events, so she was kind of presence in the UK as well. And then in 2012, the grandfather had enough of her and said, and accused her and her mother and a brother of being entitled, and tore up his will, and handed the club over to, I think, his now third wife now runs all of this. And this is the type of family drama that is not unique to New Orleans Saints. I think it's happened at other NFL clubs and in the NBA as well. With the Premier League teams, with valuations like these, and the types of owners and the types of families, I think it's something to keep an eye on. We might be seeing some of this type of succession drama to come on these shores. It's interesting, Miguel, Josh Kroenke, he seems to really want to own Arsenal, seems to like Arsenal. I wonder how much someone like him wants to say, right, I want to have a go now. Dad, you've built these things. Because don't forget, Stan Kroenke also owns, or the Kroenke Entertainment Group, owns the LA Rams and the Denver Nuggets, who most recently have actually won championships. The LA Rams in 2022, finally, after 20 years, a bit like Arsenal, win the Super Bowl. The Nuggets, first time ever, win the NBA championship. Arsenal is the one that hasn't won anything. Is this the moment that they want to say, right, Dad, let me have a go?
Yeah, it's hard. Sorry, do you want to go on, Jack?
No, go on. Sorry.
No, it's hard not to see it exactly like that. Even like there was funny. I just speaking to the second captains lads earlier. The point was made that on the day that Arsenal beat Real Madrid, Josh Kroenke was talking about having to change manager at another one of the franchises. He talked about it as a day of two halves, which is really striking as to where this is going. And this points exactly to this, discussion about how Arsenal had previously been autonomous and now they're seen as, something more central to the Kroenkes, and would point to a figure like Josh. He's definitely much more visible at the club. He's become increasingly visible. And it's gone from almost, Zooms in the COVID era with staff, naturally enough, to now, he's like suddenly, there he was at the PFA Awards with a big Arsenal contingent, and Josh Kroenke at the centre. I mean, what does that, like in the most visible and tangible terms, that is more hands-on.
And I think that's maybe where there's a slight discontinuity between the Tottenham and Arsenal examples, right? Is that the Lewis family are not really expected to be as hands-on. Traditionally they've always taken a step back. They've now, clearly they've got very involved over in recent months, but Vinay Venkatesham is the CEO. The Lewises have their man Peter Charrington as the new non-executive chairman, and I don't think we're expecting to see any kind of Josh Kroenke-like developments at Tottenham Hotspur. I just want to move on to what do you think these departures, the departure of Tim Lewis, the departure of Daniel Levy, mean for Premier League politics, Miguel? Because they're obviously Levy, as I said, he's the kind of link between the generations, right? He's the link between all those kind of big 1990s names, the kind of David Sheepshanks era that we were talking about earlier. Tim Lewis has only been in situ. I mean, he was only running Arsenal for 3 years. He was on the board for about 5 or 6 years. But he's, during that time, he rose up to being one of the most significant Premier League execs. What does that kind of Premier League table look like now in an era without Daniel Levy, without Tim Lewis?
So it's lost its loudest voice and its longest serving voice. So they are two big changes already. On the Levy one, I think it's particularly significant because I was talking to an executive very relevant to these clubs recently enough, and they were saying that one of the big changes over the past few years is that after the Big Six era, where the figures of these tables were so known, we suddenly entered into this era of transition where you had a lot of new people, not necessarily as familiar with the politics, and that it did create this. It created a much more fragmented era. And I think that's probably why someone like Steve Parish like Crystal Palace obviously aren't one of the quote unquote old Big Six, but Parish has become one of the biggest voices in the Premier League. And I do know him and Lewis, even beyond issues like the Ezid transfer, they spoke a lot. And I do just wonder, though, this is me very much speculating now, but whether we're about to enter into a new era of Premier League politics. We've gone from the Big Six to now this obviously transition period, a transition period that's actually been largely framed by the wait for the city charges. There's an expectation that the city charges could finally come, maybe the October international break, which is 2 weeks from now, although we've heard this before about certain dates. But it is interesting, I think, that just as we potentially approach this date, it does feel like the temperature on the whole city thing has been taken down a bit by a settlement in the APT case that no one expected. And I'm not saying these things are linked in any way. I don't think they are. But say if you have, suddenly there's a settlement in that, then on the other side you've got Lewis, who'd been so vocal about state ownership. He isn't in the meetings anymore. Levy, who wasn't as vocal as Lewis, but very strong views on regulation. Whether the Premier League almost enters a kind of basically a Pax Premier League era now after this. Once the charges are done and we see what happens next. Although, I mean, who knows? That could just cause chaos again. But it does feel like things are maybe trending in a certain direction. But at the very least, the arguments that are going to be put forward in meetings are going to be different, principally because Levy and Lewis aren't there.
So the tone of the meetings will change, but the fundamentals of the clubs are still, I guess, the same. You know, the idea of state investment versus, you know, the American model is still going to kind of be there, I guess. So it'd be interesting to see how this plays out. But I also wonder if everyone's just a bit tired. If you look at the Manchester City saga in isolation, the charges date back to, like, you know, there's 8 or 9 years worth of charges and almost 8 years of now investigation in case. That it's not good for any league or any competition, whether it's for Manchester City or the Premier League or anybody else. Even for us as the media, you know, it is a sorry story that has dragged on and on and on. And I wonder, you know, even City would want this to be put to bed because it's just it can't be fun. And it feels like a new era maybe at Manchester City as well. The club, perhaps, I mean, you guys are closer to it than me, but feels a bit different to when things were really, really spiky. And you know, and they were, I guess, crushing everyone as well on the field and off the field. It just feels like a different moment. Is that fair? Or maybe I might be wrong.
And on that as well, I mean, does that potentially mesh with the next stage in ownership, which is basically, I mean, one of the biggest developments in the last few years is basically sovereign wealth funds investing into private equity. And what is that if not a kind of an intertwining of football's evolution? All that, obviously, I mean, like Wilson's spoken about this, like the 1880s to 1945 was the year of the player because the player was central, and obviously so much of that around kind of wages. Then naturally players were organised into a team, so the manager became the big thing until 2003, where Abramovich, the Abramovich takeover changes everything. And while it's still going to be the era of the owner, is this the next stage in the era of the owner, where and we are talking, especially with, as you mentioned, the prices that clubs would command now, their valuation, which is we're basically only at a certain level, only sovereign wealth funds or massive private equity funds can actually own them. And we might even be moving away of this era of patriarchs. And Chelsea might be an illustration of where you've got it is a fund. And yes, while Bowley and Bedad Egbali are visible, they are only representatives really of they're co-owners of wider funds.
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting point, right? Is like, certainly it's true that the valuations of the big clubs now mean that vanishingly few people can afford to buy them, right? Like, it has to be either a sovereign wealth fund or, a consortium put together by, various kind of private equity backed types, like we saw in Chelsea. And certainly there's clubs, most clubs really are to an extent on the market, but there's lots of clubs who are very much known to be on the market who have not been sold, right? Because the valuations are so high. But do you think, it sounds like from what you're saying, Miguel, like, do you think that these kind of discussions are the discussions we're going to be having more and more? Because the idea of the chair, this is why Daniel Levy was such a throwback, right? He was a chairman, he was a minority shareholder, but he was the chairman who also ran the club. But if the owners are going to be someone on the other side of the world, then it's the kind of professional services types who they appoint to run the club, the people like Tim Lewis, who are those are going to be the decisions that really define whether a club sinks or swims.
Yeah, absolutely. And to bring this full circle, because it is worth saying, we are ultimately a football podcast. Well, given how we opened this chat, and we're talking about the extreme levels of control of the coaches like Guardiola and Arteta are responsible for, and how that stands as both a kind of a juxtaposition and also a contrast to, so it's this intense micromanagement against a game that is actually, how it's played in the pitch is shaped by forces way beyond it. And like obviously we've seen this in, say, issues like how only a certain strand of super clubs can win. It's one of the reasons why managers only go to certain clubs. So I realise that's kind of a wider point, but I do think it kind of links this together a bit, and yes, points to kind of where next.
But then you do wonder, then, is the Premier League going to be a contest of, well, it already is, I guess, competing private equity funds with 100 billion in assets from wherever and from whoever. I think Miguel's point, it'll be interesting. It'll be brought to bear maybe some point in the future. We're going to find out, and it will be through journalism rather than anything else, because the lack of transparency in all of this is remarkable. I mean, I suppose the clue's in the name, it's private equity. Who's invested in who and where the money's come from? And could there be a point where, God, we suddenly find out 6 Premier League teams have exactly the same owner class because they've invested in a bunch of funds? It is a crazy departure from, as Jack said, the eras that Daniel Levy straddled. He came in the 8th year of the Premier League, where you have local boy done good was still owning most of the teams, and now we're talking in ways of multi-billion, trillion investment funds based in the Middle East and in the US, and that is the Daniel Levy period. His 2 feet in each of these camps,
and that's such a fascinating thing as well. I mean, like, Levy straddled an era where, for all the wealth of local boy done good, you could still feasibly see them in the street. You could see them driving the car. And famously, there are photos of Levy coming out of a Premier League meeting and waiting on a bus. Whereas that now we have a strand of owner that you're just not going to get close to. And not only are you just not going to get close to, you have no idea how they're really thinking. I remember this was something that came up a lot when I was writing on the Super League stuff, that it was described to me as real masters of the universe stuff. And like someone who worked centrally with them made the point to me that you do have to understand that when people reach a certain level of wealth, it does kind of almost, it influences your psychology. You obviously, you think about all this sort of stuff in a totally different way.
Yeah, and this is I think is one of the reasons why Levy is such a fascinating and important figure, right? Is that he was a local boy, he was a Tottenham fan, he was from North East London, went to White Hart Lane as a child, and so on. He did well in his career, became chairman in his 30s, and ran the club in a very tight way. That is such a classic model. But at the same time, he was running the club on behalf of ENIC. ENIC was a company founded by Joe Lewis. Joe Lewis is a kind of legendary veteran, Bahamas-based currency trader, and so on. So even the Levy era was both it was a very traditional model, but it was also the traditional model with one foot in the kind of global 1% of the 1% of the 1%, which is what modern football's like. And it makes me think that more, I think I mentioned this earlier, like more and more the most important thing in so many of these clubs will be who do these kind of global super rich people choose to run the clubs. Like people laugh when City fans had their Lord Panic banner when he was kind of employed by the club to argue on their behalf. But in future, Premier League football will be decided by which which Magic Circle law firms are instructed by our clubs.
So on that exact point, someone said to me recently that you can track the evolution of the Premier League and football as well by the figures chosen to be chief executives. So for a while it was marketing, then it was accountants, and now it's lawyers.
Lawyers, or I mean, as we said earlier, it's either lawyers or wealth managers. The kind of Ed Woodward route. We've been talking about Tottenham. The new Tottenham non-executive chairman, Peter Charrington, is a wealth manager. He was CEO of City Private Banking, and he worked for City Private Banking for a long time. He was the global head of it, and then he went off to become a senior partner at Nexus, which is the Lewis family's kind of luxury resort business. So that is almost the other route. If you're not a corporate lawyer, that is the other route into running a football club.
The one thing, and I've actually put this to Tariq once to say it. Well, as we've been discussing this, and remember when we were discussing it when the Levy story broke about whether we should do a podcast on it. Because it's the way these stories, obviously ownership stories have always been part of the media, but they would have, like say, ENIC buying from Sugar in December 2000, that just wouldn't have created the same way. I can't remember it creating the same way as all this stuff now. It's basically treated like just the next level rung down from transfers now. That's the kind of noise that you look at Lewis the weekend. And I suppose, just a question of how that's happened, even within the context of being the ownership era, and why we should care about it in that way, why these are big stories. Like, the obvious is this affects what happens in the pitch, but it does feel like it's almost a bit more than that now as well.
Yeah, because these figures now, as you said, one thing is the numbers are so big. Two, the Premier League is so big. Add those things together, and you are taking control of 20 of the most important, or some of the most important things in sport, right? And that the profile, all of it, and why does the UAE or Sheikh Mansour want to own Manchester City? There's a reason, and that is a story. Newcastle with Saudi Arabia, and also from a football point of view, the transformational impact of owners is different to the era then. Like from Sugar to ENIC, and the types of money involved, it was quite flat. Like, it wasn't huge. Then Roman Abramovich arrives at Chelsea, for example, and effectively blows up football in a way that we've not seen. I mean, people could say with Blackburn, and with Sir Jack Walker, it was a micro version of this. But who owns your team has a massive difference from a political point of view, from a performance point of view, from how we talk about what a football club is, which we've done, I guess, throughout this podcast today. And the family stuff, just to go back to that, is really, really interesting, because the ego, another thing we've spoken about, and there is the Netflix podcast now on Matchroom, the Hearn family business. It's a bit of a cringy watch, but all throughout it's laced with Eddie Hearn, the son wanting to make his father Barry proud of him, and the only way he can do this is by taking this very successful business global or to the next level. And if I can't do that, I haven't achieved. So the chippiness of being a child of someone who's been successful is also really, really interesting, because in this case, this guy was driven to school in a limousine and silver spoon pilloried for it and told, you've been given everything. So when you get your hands on the club or the business, keeping it at the same level of success isn't successful, and that plays to the psychology. all of this is really fascinating, and luckily for them, and is Saudi Arabia, for example, and this is the element again that we've talked about. The show ends with Saudi Arabia offering, according to the Hearns, 1.5 billion pounds, which the kid Eddie has somehow convinced this sheikh to part with. The deal's not been done. I don't think it'll be done. But that's the story. Dad, you built this company in Brentwood in Essex at the top of a snooker club with £100 in your pocket, and look what we've done, and look what I've done for you. And these are the levels that we're talking about with the Premier League as well.
Well, as Kendall Roy famously said, I am the eldest boy. I am the eldest boy. And I wonder if that's something that we'll be hearing in a Premier League boardroom at some point soon, if it hasn't been said already. We've gone over time, but thank you so much to Tariq, Miguel. Thank you so much to producer Tom. Thanks to everybody who's listened this far. And thanks to everyone who replies, comments, likes, shares, subscribes, and so on. Please keep it coming. And we'll be back again later this week.